All right, so as we now move into sections, or units 5 and 6, we're talking about the Enlightenment, the new revolutions and the new societies and imperialism and industrialization. We need to start off with chapter 28, talking about the Enlightenment and also a number of revolutions. So this first video is just going to talk about the Enlightenment and some of its ideals and some of its kind of effects. And then the next video will focus predominantly on the French Revolution and its long-term effects. And then we'll move to like nationalism. And then move our way into a mixture of chapter 28 and 30, talking about the Latin American revolutions, or I should say the Atlantic revolutions, and the effects that those have on their societies going into the 1900s. So that's where we're going to begin with today, is just the idea of the Enlightenment. Whoa, that clicked a lot. So the idea of the Enlightenment, or the era, is sort of kind of coming off of the heels of the end of the Renaissance, beginning of the scientific revolution. And so the whole point of the Enlightenment is to take the ideals of the scientific revolution, where they were studying and getting a better understanding of the world through progress, through critical thinking, and challenging the status quo with natural laws, but now using that to essentially improve society. And so not just learning about like physics and gravity and things of that nature, but applying it to what's the best way to govern society, what's the best way to work within government and things of that nature. So using analysis and reasoning to create and to push for human progress and change. And so this is going to be used to justify the revolutions that go on, the new governments that are formed, and social movements for disenfranchised groups that we see obviously continuing through today into the 2020s. So the idea, one of the major ideas that comes out of this is what we call popular sovereignty. Okay, and this is the idea of increased personal rights and freedoms that limit, or at the same time limiting, the absolute power of the monarchy, limiting the power of the aristocracies and the noble classes, and also the power of the church in social and economic areas. So pretty much going against the idea of divine right government and limiting the absolute power of the monarchs, taking away power and authority of the church, and also pretty much ending feudalism, or attempts to end feudalism throughout much of Europe at this time. And going along with this is the idea, as John Locke puts in, the idea of a social contract, where we determine that, as citizens or as people, in order for us to have a government, we give up certain rights in order for the government to create and to provide and for protection, to look after our interests. And so as long as they are keeping society functioning and those things are being done and they're protecting our rights, as John Locke would say, to life, liberty, and property. That might sound familiar to the Declaration of Independence, with one slight change where we change property to pursuit of happiness. That this is what government is supposed to do. And if it doesn't do that, we have the ability to change our leaders, change our laws, and change the government completely, whether that's through elections or if that's through revolution, instead of just being replaced by another monarch or another dynasty that comes in to change things around. And so the idea also with this is that this divides up power and privilege, so it's not just in one person, but it's also, it comes from the people, all right? It is not given by God, but it's given by the people to those who are the ones who are governing the people, all right? So there has to be a system, as, and I believe I think it's Baron de Montesquieu that talks about the idea of checks and balances, so that no one power or authority has over the other. It's either Montesquieu or it's Rousseau. I always forget. All right. So equality and other rights guaranteed are only guaranteed for free white men at this time, and we slowly see that changing throughout the periods. And typically, white men who own property is typically the way that that's looked at, instead of just, again, the aristocracy, the noble classes, and the elite, and given to people who own property, who are literate, and expanding that to all men, and then eventually into other white men, and then expanding that more into other groups, including Africans, freed people, women. All right, over time. It's not a just overnight thing. Okay, it takes a long time. So this occurs in Europe at the same time as there's population boom. So again, resulting out of the Columbian Exchange and all the foods and crops that are being brought over from the Americas to help stabilize populations and to increase the nutritional value. So again, thank you, potatoes. And then also at the same time of the Industrial Revolution. So that's why I put in here also, this is also for those that know human geography, the demographic transition, stage 2. okay, where the birth rates stay high, okay, and death rates are dropping as life expectancy is increasing. And that's why we talk about the population boom itself. This also will coincide with the Industrial Revolution that we'll talk about with chapter 29. Okay, so one thing to consider is how all this compared with the ideas of absolutism, divine right, monarchs, and other powers around the globe during this time period from 1750s to 1900 and also previous eras. Okay, so other things about the Enlightenment. We have a debate between kind of the modern ideas of conservatism and liberalism, and not talking about the United States, but kind of as a whole, how do we view this? So conservatives, just if your understanding here, if you don't know it, or to give an understanding if you don't know, conservatives typically think about change happening slowly over time. We don't want to take radical steps to change society or to change government unless it's absolutely necessary, because they view it kind of like an organism. It slowly changes or government needs to slowly change as society slowly changes, right? And so that is kind of minuscule, step-by-step processes, and most of the things need to remain intact. Most of the time they look at revolutions as very messy, causing more trouble than actual change or progress, and that most of this stuff is actually unnecessary because, again, society is constantly changing, viewpoints are constantly changing, and over time things develop into different systems, such as, the end of feudalism, or as we'll see with the French Revolution, feudalism was mostly over with. At least the idea of feudalism was coming to an end by the French Revolution, or that's an argument to be made, and that slavery would eventually, die out, and people were becoming more progressive thinkers on that. And so, that's kind of some of the arguments that are being used in terms of society was slowly changing towards those things. All right. Liberals, however, view change as necessary to progress and more in favor of faster or quicker changes than a conservative would be. All right. So initially, with the liberal views, and this obviously changes, is that for the most important thing was equality before the law was more important than equality at the ballot box. So think about this in terms of the United States, where our first, the Constitution and the first 10 amendments, there's not a whole lot of stuff about voting in there. All right. But when we talk about freedoms, okay, before we get to the 15th Amendment that allows all African American men to vote, and the 19th Amendment, which allows women to vote, we have the 13th and 14th Amendments. The 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery in every case with the exception of, essentially jail. And then the 14th Amendment, which grants equal protections. So it's more about equality and being treated fairly under the law versus being allowed to vote. All right, and that, again, changes and then liberalism and liberals themselves then start to focus more on forcing the government to deal with inequities and problems that result from the Industrial Revolution. So if you remember from U.S. history, thinking to the Progressive Era and trying to limit the power of trusts, limit the power of the railroads, trying to fix, in some cases, a lot of the problems that arise out of overcrowding, sanitation, things of that nature that occur again, inside or resulting from, or a lot of it resulting from the Industrial Revolution. So, continuing on with this idea of, slavery, which we mentioned up here before and also previously on the last slide, is when discussing rights, many people did in fact notice the contradiction. We're talking about freedom and equality, but we're still denying that to a number of different people, i.e. slaves and women, and then also other minority or ethnic groups in certain countries. But again, as we said, that slowly expands to give those disenfranchised and disadvantaged groups more power, more say, even though economic inequities definitely existed at that point and, again, presently to this day. So as a result, again, due to, again, more liberal thinking and changes over time, African slave trade, or the African slave trade, actually becomes illegal. So within that, what we mean by African slave trade, we're talking predominantly about Europeans are not allowed to go into Africa, purchase slaves, and then bring them across the Atlantic Ocean, either into Europe, into North or South America. That is now illegal starting in the early 1800s, and that is actually something that they're able to agree on, like by 1808, I think it was the time frame, including the United States agrees to that, and you have British ships patrolling up and down the African coast, looking for people that are now trying to illegally bring in African slaves over to these other parts of the world, as it had now been deemed illegal by European and Western powers. So that's where that begins, and then slowly the abolition movement comes over time. Again, you can kind of think about the 1830s in Great Britain and the United States with the resulting Civil War. in 1865. And then, other places around the globe at the same time, with Cuba and Brazil being some of the last places, at least in the western part of the world, to officially end it in the 1880s. So a lot of what that gets inspired for the abolitionist movement out of religion, out of the inspirational stories of people who had been slaves, who had been escaped, who had been freedmen. A lot of revolts, so including the Great Jamaica Slave Revolt in the 1830s that actually pretty much convinced the British to end slavery within their territories, boycotting of countries and products that are made or used with slaves, things of that nature. Now again, this does not guarantee rights or freedoms or equal treatment or opportunities, but again, it was a small step in that right direction. Also, the movement towards more of the ending of serfdom in Russia continues at this time, and greater pushes again for more equality under that. At the same time, as slavery is going away, you now begin to see more, it says importation, I don't know why I use that term, but you have more people moving into the Americas, resulting from, again, slaves not wanting to, or former or now freedmen not wanting to work in plantations, in the mines if they can avoid it. And so you actually do see indentured servitude now beginning to prop up with European investors and European landowners or wealthy Creole landowners in Central and South America. So again, if you think if you remember during Human Geography, if we watched that video on, where are the 5 big religions located, and you're like, I saw that group of Hindus living in Suriname and Guyana. Well, that helps to explain it because, those were British colonies and that brought over indentured servants to work on those territories or to work on those lands, also including people from India and China and other parts. So yeah. And then when we talk about women's rights, so again, women consistently working for equality, and we'll kind of, mention a few names as we kind of go throughout this chapter and then beyond that with, within the industrialization chapter. So working for equality and equity for a very long time, including starting predominantly with the abolition of slavery, the temperance movement to ban alcohol, and a lot of the revolutionary movements. You have women fighting, you have women providing aid, supplying soldiers with goods, and essentially trying to contribute as much as possible for them to earn rights as well. But it's not just also about voting rights. A lot of it is being able to earn a living, okay, and to earn a profit, their own money, inherit, manage and own property and businesses, more educational opportunities, be able to divorce. All those are really, really big. And they question, why are men allowed to have these rights, but women are not, under the same circumstances? Or why not under the same circumstances? So for the most part, education does increase for women throughout much of the world at this time, again, within Europe and within the Americas. And there are some job opportunities, nurses, teachers, and a few, as we'll see within the Industrial Revolution, factory-type jobs, but still limited roles and limited pay. But this sets the stage for what we call first-generation feminism, which begins began before the 1800s, but throughout the 1800s and the early 1900s to vote for voting rights on a large scale. So in the next video, we'll start talking about this big one, the French Revolution.